On a Monday morning in August of 1917, 19-year-old Molly Maggia and her older sister, Albina, walked to their new jobs in the small city of Orange, New Jersey. Molly and Albina didn't really look like sisters. Molly was tall and had smooth brown hair, while Albina was an entire foot shorter and kept her own brown curls covered with a hat. But that morning, they had something in common. They were both so excited for work that they were practically bouncing along the sidewalk. A few weeks earlier, Molly and her sister had seen an advertisement for jobs at a local studio, where employees helped create one of the most fashionable items of the era: watches that glowed in the dark. This particular advertisement was looking for women who could hand paint the tiny glow-in-the-dark numbers and hands on the watch faces. And this was really exciting for Molly and Albina, because there weren't many job opportunities out there for women. At the time, women typically got stuck working in dangerous factories for extremely low wages. But this job was different. It seemed interesting and artistic, and it paid really well. Plus, it sounded glamorous, because they wouldn't have to work in a dirty factory. Instead, they'd work in a clean, well-maintained studio. Molly knew that lots of women wanted these positions, but she and her sister applied anyway, and amazingly, they both got hired. Molly was ecstatic. Not only had she landed this amazing job, but she got to go to work every day with her big sister. She'd been looking forward to their first day at work ever since. Molly turned a corner and saw the studio building. The sisters walked up and knocked on the door, and a few seconds later, a middle-aged woman wearing a plaid dress answered. She introduced herself as the studio's forewoman and led them inside. And when Molly walked into this building, she was amazed by what she saw. Dozens of these women were sitting in rows, paintbrushes in hand, dipping them into this glowing powder and then applying them to the watch face over and over and over again. They were working so quickly, it was like their hands were this glowing blur. The more Molly watched, the more excited she was to be one of these women. However, just then, the forewoman told Molly and her sister that they wouldn't actually be painting that day. Before they ever touched a brush, they had to learn what a well-painted watch looked like. The forewoman led Molly and her sister past the sparkling painters and into a totally different room. There, Molly saw a handful of young women inspecting watch faces that had already been painted. Now, Molly was not very excited about doing quality control, but she knew this was a necessary step towards becoming a full-time watch painter. The forewoman introduced Molly and her sister to the inspector who'd be training them. Her name was Catherine Schaub. The forewoman explained that Catherine was just 15 years old and had only been working at the studio for about 6 months. However, in that time, she'd worked her way up from being an apprentice to a painter and now an instructor. The forewoman told Molly and her sister that they too could be like Catherine if they worked hard enough. Then she left and headed back out to the main studio. After she was gone, Catherine began showing Molly and Albina the ropes. Molly watched as Catherine spread a few circular paper watch faces out on the table. Catherine explained that each watch face was pre-printed, so the paper was black and the numbers were white. Painters would then go over the white numbers with the glow-in-the-dark paint. But it was really important that none of the paint went outside the lines. Otherwise, the whole thing would have to be thrown out. And so for the next several days, Molly and her sister inspected watch faces, and Catherine would then check their work. Once they'd both gotten the hang of spotting imperfections, Catherine told them it was time to learn how to paint. This was what Molly had been waiting for. She was so excited. She watched as Catherine demonstrated how to mix water and glue together to create the liquid base for the paint. She explained that they would dip their brushes into the liquid, then into the glow-in-the-dark powder, and then use that to paint. Next, Catherine showed Molly and her sister the paintbrushes they'd be using, and Molly couldn't believe how tiny they were. Each one was made out of wood and camel hair. The handle was incredibly thin, and the brush itself was made of just 30 hairs. However, Catherine warned them that even though the brush appeared to look very sharp, the bristles often would spread the more it was used, causing the paint to kind of go outside of the lines. And so Catherine told them to always make sure they kept the tip of their brush very sharp before making a stroke. Molly nodded, grabbed a paintbrush, and started practicing. A few weeks later, Molly sat down amongst the rows of women in the main studio, painting one watch face after another. While her sister Albina was still struggling to get the hang of painting, Molly had quickly proven that she was a natural artist and had been promoted to full-time painter very quickly. She would get paid for every watch face that she completed without error, so she made sure to work really fast. Molly was so good at her job that she could actually paint and socialize at the same time without slowing down at all. So, as she painted that day, she also gossiped and cracked jokes with the young woman who sat across from her, whose name was Ella Eckert. Molly had actually been kind of intimidated by her when they first met, but now they were like best friends. And so as Molly slid a finished watch face to the side and grabbed a new one, Ella leaned across the table and said she wanted to show her something. Molly watched as Ella dipped her paintbrush into the glow-in-the-dark powder, but then instead of painting a watch, she began painting her own fingernails. Ella painted each nail on her right hand, and then held up her hand and wiggled her fingers to show Molly. Even in the brightly lit studio, Ella's fingernails glowed beautifully. It was like the most amazing, expensive-looking nail polish Molly had ever seen. So Molly started painting her nails too, and the next thing she knew, other women in the studio were doing the same thing. Four years later, in 1921, Molly showed up for another day of painting watches at the studio. And she felt especially lucky to be there because over the past 4 years, this company she worked for had changed hands and downsized. And so a lot of women were laid off, and some had to quit to find other work, including her sister Albina. Because Molly was one of the very best painters there, she'd managed to keep her job. That day, after walking into the main studio, Molly waved at a few coworkers and smiled, and then sat down and got to work. The repetitive movement of dipping the brush in the powder and then painting the watch over and over and over again was sort of like meditation. Molly kind of zoned out as she did it. But on this day, she suddenly felt the sharp pain inside of her mouth. Molly winced. She'd had a tooth pulled a few weeks ago after getting a really bad toothache, and the spot where it used to be had not healed well. She kept accidentally pressing on it with her tongue and making it hurt even worse. Molly shook off this new pain and went back to work. She painted a big stack of watch faces and then stood up to bring them to the studio's forewoman. But as she was walking over, her tongue flicked back to the sore spot on her gums, and she winced again. Molly knew she was making the pain worse, but she couldn't stop herself from messing with the sore. It should have healed by now, which made her think that maybe the dentist didn't know what he was doing. She told herself that if this sore did not get any better, she would have to go see a different dentist. A month later, in October of 1921, the sore in Molly's mouth was still there, so she did go and find a new dentist. She walked into his office, and she met this tall, middle-aged man with big glasses. He introduced himself as Dr. Joseph Neff, then led her back to an exam room and asked what had brought her in that day. Molly explained that about 2 months ago, she'd gotten a toothache and had one tooth removed, but her gums never healed, and ever since, the pain in her mouth had only gotten worse. It had spread all the way across her gums and into her lower jaw. Molly told Dr. Neff that she suspected her first dentist had actually done something wrong to cause all of this pain, and so she was really hoping that he, this new dentist, would be able to fix that. Dr. Neff nodded, then leaned Molly back and asked her to open up her mouth. He used a metal tool to prod at her teeth, and after only a few moments, he told Molly that her gums looked very swollen and several of her teeth were loose. Molly was immediately terrified and said she didn't want to lose any more teeth, but Dr. Neff assured her that would not happen. He said her pain had nothing to do with the first dentist that she saw. Instead, she had a common condition called periodontitis, which is a gum disease caused by bacteria. As soon as they got the bacteria out of her mouth, her gums would heal, and she would feel much better. So Dr. Neff gave Molly a special antibacterial mouthwash, and then she was on her way feeling very optimistic. A few weeks later, in November, Molly sat in the main studio painting and tried to focus on her work. A few of her coworkers were gossiping and laughing beside her, but Molly was in so much pain that nothing felt funny to her anymore. She didn't even want to open her mouth to laugh, because then everyone would see that she was missing multiple teeth. Her smile, which she used to think was one of her best features, was now full of holes. Dr. Neff had promised her that she would not lose any more teeth, but that had not been true. Even though Molly had been using the antibacterial mouthwash exactly as instructed, her condition only got worse. Her gums continued swelling and her teeth got looser and looser until eventually they just started falling out. And every time Molly lost a tooth, a painful ulcer formed where the tooth used to be, so her gums were extremely swollen, all of her teeth were either loose or missing, and her mouth was full of these horrible, painful sores. Molly had been back to Dr. Neff's office multiple times, but all he'd been able to do was prescribe painkillers. He couldn't actually figure out what was happening to her teeth, let alone figure out how to stop it. And as if the situation wasn't bad enough, over the last few days, Molly had noticed that her breath smelled horrible. No matter how many times she brushed her teeth or used mouthwash, the smell just would not go away. Molly didn't know what to do. She used to feel totally at home in the watch painting studio, but now she felt totally alone. The next day, Dr. Neff was at his dental office when he heard the front door open. He looked over and saw Molly, and she looked like she'd been crying. She told him that she was in so much pain that she'd had to quit her job. She really just needed to know what was going on with her. Dr. Neff quickly ushered her back to an exam room, leaned her back in a chair, and took a look at her few remaining teeth. And almost immediately, he noticed the awful smell coming out of Molly's mouth. As a dental professional, Dr. Neff actually recognized this scent. It was not typical bad breath. It was the smell of Molly's teeth rotting inside of her mouth. By this point, Dr. Neff knew his original diagnosis of a bacterial infection just had to be wrong. He thought over all of Molly's symptoms: swollen gums, painful ulcers that wouldn't heal, and now rotting teeth. And at first, he just couldn't make sense of them all. But then, Dr. Neff had an idea. To him, Molly's symptoms seemed very similar to a condition dentists sometimes called phossy jaw, which caused swelling, sores, toothaches, and the gradual death of the teeth and jawbones. Phossy was short for phosphorus, and the condition was caused by phosphorus poisoning. It was most common amongst people who worked in factories that manufactured products using phosphorus, like matches. So Dr. Neff asked Molly what she did for work. She explained to him that she used to be a watch painter before she'd had to quit. Dr. Neff asked her if the paint that they were using contained phosphorus, and Molly said she had no idea. Dr. Neff explained his theory to Molly and then told her he would go over to the watch studio himself to follow up. So after their appointment was over, he went to the studio and actually spoke to the forewoman, and she would tell the dentist there was definitely no phosphorus in the paint. Dr. Neff sighed. He was back at square one. About 6 months later, in May of 1922, Dr. Neff led Molly to an exam room for yet another dental appointment. He still had not been able to determine what was wrong with her, but every time she came into his office, she looked worse than before. That day, Molly limped towards the exam chair and slowly lowered herself into the seat. She said another doctor had diagnosed her with rheumatism in her hips and feet, which basically meant that her bones and joints ached all the time. Dr. Neff looked at Molly. She was only 24 years old, but it was like her whole body was disintegrating. He didn't know what to say, but he still held on to hope that he might be able to diagnose and treat her. So he leaned Molly back in the chair and asked her to open up her mouth. But when she did, she immediately winced and pointed at her jaw. Dr. Neff used his fingers to feel around her cheek and jawbone on the outside, but despite how gentle he was being, he literally heard her jawbone crack. When he reached into her mouth, he literally picked up a chunk of her lower jaw and pulled it right out. Dr. Neff was so shocked he was just frozen for a moment, holding Molly's broken bone in his hand. She looked at him, clearly afraid, confused, and in horrible pain. But all Dr. Neff could do was give her more pain medication and tell her, "Come back if anything changes." And a week later, Molly did come back. She told Dr. Neff the pain in her jaw was absolutely unbearable, even with the pain medication. And so once again, Dr. Neff reached into her mouth to examine her, except this time, what was left of her lower jaw just disintegrated into his hands. Dr. Neff was horrified. Whatever was wrong with Molly, he didn't know if it was something he could even fix, and so he arranged to have her sent straight to the hospital. A month later, in June, Dr. Neff was back at his office doing what he did a lot these days, thinking about Molly. He knew hospital doctors had done their best to fix and stitch up her face, but Molly was now left so disfigured because of her jaw disintegrating that she rarely left her apartment anymore, because people would just stare and point at her. On top of that, Dr. Neff knew that Molly was still in constant, debilitating pain, no matter what pain meds she was on. Dr. Neff knew he couldn't give Molly her jaw back, but he kept thinking that if he could just come up with a diagnosis, he might at least be able to lessen her pain. So he thought about her symptoms, her job, her lifestyle as a young, unmarried woman who lived alone. And suddenly he had an idea. What if Molly had syphilis? Syphilis is a sexually transmitted infection that can cause painful ulcers and body aches. But Dr. Neff thought maybe it could cause other symptoms, like bone decay. He wanted to test Molly for syphilis, but in the 1920s, there was a huge stigma around syphilis in the United States. People who contracted the infection, especially unmarried women, were seen as dirty and immoral. The stigma was so severe that Dr. Neff didn't even want to bring up the possibility to Molly that she might have syphilis in fear of offending her. So he decided he would do the test secretly. The next time Molly visited his office, he told her he wanted to take a blood sample to test, but he didn't say why. And Molly, who was just so desperate to figure out what was going on with her, said that was fine. And so after she left and Dr. Neff had the blood sample, he tested it for syphilis. And sure enough, her blood came back positive for the infection. Finally, he had an answer for all of Molly's symptoms. However, it wasn't as simple as calling her back to the office and giving her medication, because at the time, there were no effective treatments for syphilis. Dr. Neff couldn't do anything to help her, and he figured if Molly knew she had syphilis, which was so stigmatized, she'd be overcome with shame. So Dr. Neff decided not to tell her or her family at all. Three months later, on September 12, 1922, Molly's older sister, Albina, came to visit Molly, who was now confined to her room at a boarding house. Albina tried to put on a brave face, but as soon as she walked inside, she was overcome with emotion, because her little sister barely even looked like a person anymore. She basically looked like a living skeleton. Molly had lost all of her teeth and her lower jaw, she could barely eat, and her body was basically wasting away. Her bones looked like they were trying to rip their way out of her skin. Albina looked into her little sister's eyes, and she could see that Molly was suffering. It was like she was trapped inside of this body that was just failing her, and nobody knew why, so nobody could help her. Albina sat down next to Molly and held her hand. She stared down at her sister's skinny fingers while she told Molly what was going on with their parents and their other sisters, and how much everybody loved her and missed her. And then, Albina heard a gurgling sound. She looked up and saw blood pouring from what was left of Molly's mouth. Albina jumped up and ran to find a doctor, but by the time she and the doctor got back, there was blood all over Molly, her eyes were glassy, and she wasn't breathing. She was dead. Albina just stood there, frozen in shock. Later, Molly's parents and other sisters joined Albina at the boarding house, where Dr. Neff would finally inform them that Molly had died of syphilis. Albina and the rest of her family couldn't believe it. 5 years later, on October 15, 1927, Albina, her sister's husbands, and her father went to the cemetery where Molly was buried. And Albina's stomach twisted with nerves, because they were not going there just to visit her little sister's grave. As they neared the cemetery, Albina saw a well-dressed group of men gathered by the entrance. She knew they were all doctors and lawyers who were there to witness the same thing that she and her family were. Albina, her relatives, and this big group of men walked through the cemetery gates, past dozens of gravestones, until they reached the spot where Molly was buried. And then, the men began to dig Molly up. Albina was terrified of what her sister's body might look like, but she knew exhuming Molly was necessary. Because in the years since Molly's death, dozens of women who worked at that watch painting studio had gotten sick with the exact same symptoms that Molly had. Several had become severely disfigured or died. And even though the owner of the studio insisted the women's health problems had nothing to do with their work, the women didn't believe it. It seemed impossible to deny that something in that studio was making them all sick. So, 5 of these women had banded together, lawyered up, and were attempting to sue the studio. But to make their case, they needed to prove a direct connection between the women's work and their illnesses. They hoped Molly's remains could give them that proof. Albina watched as the men used ropes and chains to lift Molly's coffin out of the ground. Once it was out, they slowly pried open the lid. And as soon as Albina saw her little sister's body, she gasped. Molly's skeleton was glowing. Molly's remains were brought to a medical examiner's office for an autopsy, and it was quickly determined that she did not die of syphilis. She'd never actually had syphilis at all. It turned out Dr. Neff had performed the syphilis test incorrectly and gotten a false positive result. However, the doctors and lawyers overseeing the autopsy had a hunch about what did kill Molly. It was the glow-in-the-dark paint that she and the other women at the studio used. They knew this paint contained a specific chemical element, which was what made it glow. The general public believed this element was safe. In fact, it was often prescribed as a medication, added to beauty products, and even put in toothpaste. Molly and the other women at the studio knew this element was in the paint, and they also knew they sometimes ingested a small amount of it during their workday. Because, as Molly was told during her onboarding, one of the big issues with the paintbrushes is the bristles would begin to flatten out over time. And so it was important, as a painter, to make sure the points on those brushes were sharp. And so the women had developed this technique called lip pointing, where they would take the paintbrush and they would put it in their mouth and tighten their lips around it to tighten the bristles, and then dip it in the paint and paint the watch. But each time they did that, there was always a little bit of the paint still on the brush that would go into their mouth and be ingested. Now, some women thought that maybe ingesting this element might be good for them, while others were a bit more hesitant and actually asked if the paint was safe. And their supervisors would always tell them that yes, it was. However, scientists and the owner of the studio knew that was not true. In reality, the element was extremely dangerous, and it was becoming increasingly obvious as more women from the watch painting studio became desperately ill. So, at this point, the doctors and lawyers wanted to prove that Molly's body contained a lethal amount of the element found in the paint. To do this, they performed a test that involved burning Molly's bones to ash, dissolving that ash in acid, and then checking for the element. And just as they'd thought, Molly's bones were full of radium. Radium is an incredibly toxic radioactive element. When it enters a person's body, it gradually destroys their bones and other tissues. In Molly's case, it caused her gums to swell, her teeth to fall out, and her jaw to fall off. Molly ultimately died because the radium poisoning ate through her jugular vein, which is one of the largest and most important veins in the body. This caused her to suddenly bleed to death. After it was proven that radium was killing the watch painters, the 5 women who filed the lawsuit all received settlement payments from their employer, the U.S. Radium Corporation. These included a lump sum plus an annual payment. However, these women did not really get to enjoy this settlement because eventually they all died of radium poisoning. Meanwhile, other similar studios continued operating in the United States. At least 50 women died as a direct result of radium exposure in these studios, including Catherine, the 15-year-old girl who had initially trained Molly and her sister, and Ella, Molly's friend who sat near her at the workbench, who showed her how she painted her nails with the radium. Eventually, another court case was filed, which led to better protections for people who worked with radioactive elements. However, by that point, it was already far too late for Molly and the other women who were unknowingly poisoned by their jobs, and who, to this day, still glow inside of their graves. At 11:40 a.m. on December 21st, 2003, 3 young men who were longtime childhood friends hopped in a truck and began traveling south. They were 22-year-old Brett Mann and 19-year-olds Sean Blowers and Ashley McGuff. They lived in a coastal city called Darwin, which is actually the capital of the Northern Territory in Australia. The Northern Territory, also known as the Top End, is located in the central north of the continent. It is 6 times larger than the UK, but has 280 times less people living in it. Specifically, the UK is home to roughly 70 million people, whereas the Top End is home to only 250,000 1,000 people, and half of them live in Darwin. There are many reasons why the top end is so underpopulated, ranging from politics to poor infrastructure, but the most obvious reason that so few people choose to live in this part of Australia is because it is wildly rugged and dangerous. It is scorchingly hot year-round, and the weather in general is just unbelievably unpredictable and violent. And as the old saying goes, all the animals there are trying to kill you and each other. But Brett, Sean, and Ashley had grown up in Darwin, and so they were accustomed to the hazards of living in the top end, and so they weren't really concerned about them. What they were concerned with was finding things to do and not getting bored in the city. That particular day, in order to ward off boredom, the trio had decided they would head out to a salt flat that was located about 50 miles to the southwest of Darwin. It was this wide open plain that they could just race around on their quad bikes on. And so they loaded these quad bikes into their trailer, attached it to their truck, they hopped in their truck, and at 11:40 a.m., they started heading south out of Darwin. The first road they were on was this fairly desolate dirt road that wound around through the wilderness, and it passed by the iconic eucalyptus trees that are very well known in Australia. It passed by palm trees and giant termite mounds. And after driving on this dirt road for about 30 minutes, the trio passed by the Tumbling Waters Holiday Park, which is a vacation resort for adventurous families. And then beyond this park, there really was no more civilization. They were headed right into the outback of Australia. And so this was kind of like the last mark of civilization. And so the trio, they drive for another 30 minutes past the park. And at some point, all of the trees on either side of the road start getting more and more dense until they begin kind of encroaching over the road, as if it looks like you're driving directly through the heart of a jungle. And they would have recognized this change in scenery as meaning they were nearing the Finnis River, which was off to the right beyond all of the trees. So they couldn't see it, but they knew they were close. And the Finnis River was not a huge waterway. It was a 30-mile stretch that ran east to west through the top end. And what it was known for was being very brackish and dark. You could not see into this water more than maybe an inch or two. So it almost appeared black. And so the trio continued driving along through this kind of jungle atmosphere until the left side of the road began to thin out again, and then it eventually revealed the salt flats up to their left. And so at that point, the trio pulled off on the right side of the road where the vegetation was still very thick. And then the trio hopped out of the truck, they went around to their trailer, they dropped the gate, and one by one, they pulled their quad bikes off, and then each of them hopped on and drove out onto the flats. That day, the flats were actually very muddy because it had recently rained really heavy in that area. And so the trio spent just as much time racing each other on the flats as they did trying to drive close to each other and spray mud on each other. And so for hours, they were out there having a great time. And then at 4:30 p.m., they decided it was time to call it a day. And so they drove back over to the truck. They drove their quad bikes up onto the trailer. They locked it. And then they were about to get into the truck to head back home when one of them suggested, hey, let's head down to the water and rinse our clothes off and get all this mud off of us. Now, you need to understand, in the top end, the place you want to spend the least amount of time in is the water. People in the top end assume that in any natural water body that is not clearly designated as a swimming area has at least one animal lurking in it that will kill you. This is a literal precaution people in the top end take. And so this section of the Finnis River that these three friends were thinking about going and jumping into and washing off inside of, this was not a clearly designated swimming area, and so it should be avoided. But you need to remember, these three guys, they grew up in the top end. They were used to living in this kind of wild area, and they'd also come to the salt flats so many times over the years, and they had jumped into the Finnis River before to wash off and go swimming, and nothing had ever happened. And so really, the idea that the Finnis River could be dangerous to them, it didn't really cross their mind. They felt like, you know what, we've been there, done that, nothing's gonna happen to us. And so they left the truck and walked away from the salt flats into this mangrove forest that's only a couple of feet off the road and began walking towards this river. Normally, the trip from the road through the forest to the river bank, basically where the forest ended and you reach the river, it would take about 10 minutes. But after walking in this mangrove for maybe a minute, they were already standing in river water. It was only a couple of inches of this water, but it
it signaled to the guys that clearly the river is very swollen from all of the recent rains, enough so that it overflowed beyond its natural boundaries and it's flooded the mangrove forest. But the three guys, they look at each other and think, meh, what's the big deal? I'm sure we'll be fine. And so the guys continued moving on, but as the mangroves began to thin out, they began to slow down dramatically because the riverbanks on the edges of the Finnis River were very, very steep. If you were standing on dry land, if there was no flooding, and you were right on the edge of the Finnis River, if you took even 1 or 2 steps into the river, you would slip down under the water and the water would be over your head. Now, as these guys are walking, because the ground is flooded with this black, brackish water, they couldn't see the ground, and so they couldn't tell where the drop-off into the river was. And so they began to slow down, and then when all the trees were practically gone, they knew they were close, and then one of them actually slipped and kind of tumbled down the edge for a second, but he turned and he grabbed one of the roots of the mangrove tree and pulled himself back up. And then the other two, after seeing this, they walked over and stood next to him, and the trio just stood there looking out at this pitch black looking river that was very clearly moving faster than normal because of all this excess rain. But they kind of looked at each other and thought, you know what, it's not that big of a deal. We'll hold on to the roots of these mangroves and lower ourselves over the embankment. We'll wash ourselves off, pull ourselves back up. No big deal. And so they each turned around and grabbed a root of one of the many mangrove trees that marked the edge of this forest. And while holding on, they would lower their lower half down past the embankment until they were submerged. They rubbed all the mud off of themselves, being very careful not to let go of the mangrove at any point. And then as they were about to finish up and pull themselves back up and get back to their truck, Brett loses his balance and somehow lets go of the mangrove root and slips down the steep embankment, and suddenly the current takes him away from his friends and out to the middle of this river, and before long he's getting pulled downstream. And so he yells out to Ashley and Sean, who had their backs turned to him. They turn around, they see their friend, and they instinctively leap into the river to try to go get him and help swim him back to the side. Now, all three of them were very competent swimmers, and so this was not a high panic situation. This was more like a inconvenience and maybe a little bit funny, and so that's why they leapt in no problem. They figured, worst case scenario is we'll drift somewhere down there and we'll get out and we'll walk our way back to our car. But as soon as Sean and Ashley were free floating in this river, they felt how strong this current was, and it was way stronger than they were anticipating. And so they actually started to get a little bit worried, and they looked up ahead of them, and Brett, who had been in the water for 10 or 15 seconds before they leapt in, he had already moved way farther downstream than them. And so they decided, you know what, we have to get out, but we need to get to Brett first. We all need to get out at the same place. And so they decide they're going to swim downstream, meet up with Brett, and then get the heck out of that river as fast as they possibly can. And so they yell out to Brett hey, we're coming to get you. And they start swimming as fast as they possibly can. And with the help of the current, they manage to get all the way up to Brett relatively quickly, maybe a couple of minutes. And when they reach him, Sean and Ashley go in front of Brett. And then the three of them, they stop actively swimming and they allow the current to just kind of carry them downstream. And as they're drifting, they begin scouting the left side of the river for a solid clump of mangrove trees they can swim into, because unless there's something to grab onto on the edge of this river, they can't pull themselves out. And so at this point, the trio is definitely uncomfortable being in the water because of how strong that current is, but they're confident they're going to find a viable landing spot and they're going to get out of here and it will be a great story. And so Sean is in the front, Ashley is right behind him, and then Brett is behind Ashley. And they're all about an arm's length away from each other. And they're drifting down this river for a couple of minutes. They're looking on the left side for a viable landing spot. And then all of a sudden, Ashley just yells out, hey, I see something in the water. We need to get out. Find the nearest tree. Get out, get out, get out. And so Sean, he starts panicking. He doesn't even turn around to see what's going on behind him. Adrenaline kicks in and he swims as fast as he possibly can to a tree that's popped out of the river. It's literally growing in the middle of the river. And so he swims up to this tree. He manages to climb up to the first fork of the tree, which is maybe 6 or 8 feet above the water. And as soon as he's up there, he turns around and looks down and he sees Ashley. He reaches down and he hoists Ashley up to the first fork with him. And then the pair turn around again to grab Brett. but Brett's not there. And so they look around, they're thinking, okay, did Brett not make it to the tree? Did the current pull him around? Is he at some other tree? They're yelling out for him, they're looking for him, but there's no Brett. And so they're talking to each other, Ashley and Sean. They're saying, hey, did he call out? Did you hear something? Did he give some indication about where he was going? And they're saying, no, I don't know where he is. And so they start climbing up the tree a little bit and trying to look down and up the river to see if maybe they can see him. And then all of a sudden, Sean notices something yellow flash beneath them in the water. And so he looks straight down and he sees this yellow thing down there. And so he nudges Ashley and he says, look. And so Ashley looks down, and as they're looking, they're about 10 feet off the water at this point. They see this yellow thing start rising up to the surface. Now, the water is so dark, they really can't tell what anything is unless it is at the surface. And so they're watching this yellow thing, and suddenly it comes out of the water, and they see it's Brett. He's got his yellow jacket on. That's what they saw. And Brett is in the mouth of a 13-foot-long saltwater crocodile. He is face down, and his left side is being held in this animal's mouth, and he's not moving. And so Sean and Ashley are so scared, they're just frozen. They're just staring at this monster that's in the water, that's holding their friend underwater, and they can't do anything about it. And for 2 minutes, they just stand there looking at this animal, wondering what's going to happen. And for those entire 2 minutes, the crocodile stared right back up at Ashley and Sean as if it was showing them what it was going to do to them once they got in the water. That I've done this to your friend, I'm getting you to as well. And so they're staring at this animal when suddenly it just kind of goes underneath the water, back down into the black abyss, and it, along with Brett, just disappear. Ashley and Sean are so terrified that they can't even grieve for their friend. They can't feel sad for him. It's like they just go into survival mode. And without saying anything to each other, they just start climbing up this tree as fast and as far as they possibly can. And they only manage to get up maybe a couple more feet to 2 more branches. One's at about 10 or 12 feet off the water, and the other is at about 15 feet off the water. And so Sean makes it onto the lower branch, and then Ashley makes it onto the slightly higher branch. And then once they're situated on their branch and one arm is firmly wrapped around the trunk of the tree, they're able to kind of breathe for a second and take stock of their situation. And even though, of course, the elephant in the room here is that their friend was just eaten by a crocodile, but it's like they can't process that yet. Instead, they start talking about, okay, well, our families, they're going to recognize our absence, and they're going to tell the police, and the police are going to launch a search, and they're going to come find us. Both of them were confident, or they acted confident, that that was going to happen, but they also knew that there was no timeline for this. It could be hours or days until this actually happened. And so as these two teens are sitting on their branches, the reality of their situation really started to come crashing down on them. Because yeah, they're safe in this tree, but how long can they possibly stay in this tree for? I mean, eventually they're going to need to fall asleep. And if they fall asleep, are they going to fall out of the tree and land in the water with this crocodile? I mean, they just didn't know how this was going to turn out. And so as the two began comforting each other, reassuring each other that, oh no, it's going to be just fine. Someone's going to find us tonight or tomorrow. We'll be just fine. As they're doing that, Ashley suddenly stops talking to Sean and just looks straight down. And so Sean realizes what Ashley's doing, and he matches his gaze. And he looks straight down, and at the base of their tree, in that black water, is the 13-foot-long saltwater crocodile. It's back, and it no longer has Brett in its mouth. They have no idea where Brett is. He's just gone. Saltwater crocodiles are considered the most aggressive and dangerous crocodiles in the world. And they are one of only 2 crocodile species that will actively hunt humans when given a chance. And so these 2 teens are helpless in this tree. All they have is some separation from the black water and this animal down below. And so they just find themselves staring straight down at this crocodile. And in turn, this crocodile just stares right back up at them. It's very clearly waiting for them. It wants them to come out of the tree so it can eat them. And so the crocodile just continuously repositions itself all around the tree. It's just keeping the top of its head out of the water so its eyes can look up at them. And so the teens are just praying that at some point it will grow tired of them and will leave. And after several hours, right as the sun is about to set, this crocodile does seem to give up on them, and it drifts under the water and disappears. After a couple of minutes, Sean, who was on the slightly lower branch, decides he doesn't want to be any closer to the water than he needs to be, and he's going to climb up to Ashley's branch. And so he very carefully stands up on his branch. He makes sure he's got solid footing, and then he reaches up and he grabs a branch with his right hand, and he kind of tests it, and he feels like it's pretty sturdy. And then he puts all his weight on it and tries to reach for another branch, when this one breaks. And as soon as that branch broke, Sean tumbled 10 feet into the water. And so he hits the water, he goes all the way under, he sinks a few feet under, and immediately he's turned around and he's trying to swim as fast as he can to the surface, and he's just expecting at any moment this crocodile is going to bite him. He gets to the surface and he looks around. It's a little bit dark, but he can immediately see his tree, and he realizes the current has pulled him away from his tree. And so in a panic, he starts swimming and kicking his legs as hard as he possibly can to get back to this tree. And he knows the whole time he's kicking his legs, he's just attracting the attention of this crocodile, but he's got nothing else he can do. He's got no other tree he can reasonably get to that will provide safety from this animal. And so with every ounce of energy he's got, he kicks and swims, and finally he manages to grab a root of this tree that his friend is still inside of, and he begins pulling himself with his lower half still submerged in the water. And so as he's dragging himself towards the trunk of this tree, he's just waiting for this crocodile to bite down on his legs, and finally he gets to the trunk of the tree and he's able to pull his body out of the water, and he clambers up to that original branch he was on, and then he and Ashley work to get him up to Ashley's branch. And as soon as he sits down next to Ashley and he's secure, they both look down, and just a little ways away from the tree, basically in the area where Sean had just landed in the water, they see with the little light that is left, this crocodile swimming right back over to the tree, and it camps out right underneath. Sean had gotten out just in time. When the sun finally did set about 10 or 15 minutes later, it became pitch black. There's no ambient light in this part of the world. There aren't any buildings or cities close enough to this area. And so it is truly pitch black. And so they could no longer see the crocodile down below. But they knew it was there because periodically they would hear it repositioning itself right underneath them. Also, because it was so dark, the two teens could not actually see each other. And so they began holding on to each other. And then anytime either of them moved, they would announce their movement to the other, just so they knew they had not fallen asleep and were not falling out of the tree to a horrible death. And so a few hours went by like this, where it was silence with the exception of the sounds of this crocodile repositioning itself periodically. A little after midnight, a huge storm rolled into this area, and it began absolutely downpouring, and the raindrops that were hitting the river were so loud that the teens could no longer hear the sound of this crocodile. And so they had no idea if it was still down below them or not. But every time lightning would strike, it would illuminate the sky for that flash of a second. And in that flash, they would look down and there would be the crocodile. After several hours of this super intense downpour, the two teens also started to become concerned that all this additional rain could raise the water level of the river all the way up high enough that this crocodile might be able to jump out and reach their legs. But because it was so dark, they couldn't actually see the top of the water. And so they had no way of knowing if the water levels were actually rising or not. And so they both kind of sucked their legs up onto this branch and tried to make themselves as small as they could while still remaining anchored to each other and also to the branch. And that's how they sat for the next several hours, just hoping they would survive the night. Finally, when the sun came up that following morning, the teens immediately noticed that the crocodile was still right below them, just lurking at the base of the tree, waiting for them. And they also noticed the water level of the river had clearly come up quite a bit. And so if they weren't rescued soon, there was a good chance that another heavy rainstorm, that crocodile would be in range of them, and there was nowhere they could go. They were as high up as they could get. Not to mention the fact they were hypothermic, they were weak, they were tired, and if you fall asleep, you're going to fall in the water. And so the two teens, they knew they did not have much time left. Luckily, at 10 a.m. that morning, they heard the sound of a police officer who was out in the mangrove forest. It turned out their families had recognized their absence. They had called the police, and that morning a search had been launched. They had found their truck and then had been walking down the river yelling out to them, and then they finally did find them. Initially, when they located these two teens stuck in the tree, they called in a helicopter to hover over them and lower down a ladder that could climb back up. But when the helicopter got close to this tree, the rotor wash from the spinning blades, it practically blew the boys out of the tree, and this crocodile was still in the water. The rescuers could see it, the boys could still see it, and so there was this fear that the helicopter would literally send them into the water to their death. And so they had to abandon the helicopter approach. However, the blades of that helicopter did ultimately scare this crocodile, and the crocodile swam away. And so as soon as the helicopter was off station, situation, they had a boat come in, and the boat got right underneath the two boys. They jumped down into it, and they were brought to safety. The two boys were brought to a hospital where doctors determined they were physically okay, but both of them were severely traumatized from what they had just been through. As for Brett, despite an exhaustive search of that river, they never found his body or any of his clothing or any belongings he had on him, and they never found the crocodile that